Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our actual last session of National Distance Learning Week. We're wrapping it up with a great one here. I think you'll find pure pedagogy. So we are joined today by Travis Matteson, and Travis is the chair of the Department of English and Humanities at Alfred State College. He holds a PhD in English from UB with a focus on new media and poetics. At Alfred State, Dr. Matteson teaches technical and new media writing for Alfred State's new Bachelor of Science program in technical communication and emergent media, which sounds like a fascinating topic to me, actually, from a humanities background myself. Travis is also a 2023 SUNY online teaching ambassador, so we are pleased to see him engaging with our community in this way and sharing your expertise today, Travis. I'm going to turn it over to you and encourage folks to participate in the chat. Please ask questions as we go along.
Well, thank you, Erin. And thanks everybody for being here. I look forward to hearing from you via the chat and in a Q&A at the end, I think we're going to be doing. So just by way of introduction here, this conversation grew out of some work that I've been doing as the chair of the e-learning committee, which is part of our faculty senate here at Alfred State. And we're looking at, part of our charge is to monitor the impact of online learning on retention, which if you've explored retention data, this is pretty difficult to track because we have a lot of data about students who are enrolled in online only programs, but it's harder to measure the impact of taking an online class for our residential students. And we discovered that something around 70% of our residential students end up taking at least one online class at some point during their time here. And we're working on developing some recommendations, both at our administrative and instructional levels, to ensure that taking an online class is not a retention sink, and just to kind of incorporate some high impact practices in online teaching that can benefit our students and keep them engaged and help them persist toward their degree. I'm also, as Erin said, a professor in the English department, and I teach primarily technical writing classes, both in person and online. And I have taught both 15-week online asynchronous, 7-week online accelerated asynchronous, and intersession courses, which can be as short as 3 weeks long. And so I've worked a lot with the modularity of these courses. How do they kind of accordion out to a 15-week class and ensure the kind of instructional integrity at a really hyper accelerated version as well. So in my seated classes, I talk about the value of collaboration, and I especially emphasize the fact that collaboration is not just group work that I'm assigning so I have less to grade, but it's actually part of the subject matter of technical communication. It's chapter 4 in our textbook, in fact. But facilitating the production of collaborative writing, it's a lot easier with seated classes where you can break people into groups in the room and ask them to start working, and you can check in with them and circle the room. With asynchronous instruction, particularly accelerated asynchronous online learning in a 7-week or a 3-week model, collaborating on the production of a writing project is nearly impossible because it takes about 3 weeks for them to even get familiar with each other, let alone trust each other enough to collaborate on building something. And so, that's another conversation if you have ideas for how they might be able to build something. But in this conversation, I'm just going to share some of the background on student engagement and retention in online classes, particularly through this one literature review that I've come across and found valuable. I'm going to talk about the idea of peer pedagogy, which is not my term. It involves learning in non-academic contexts from peers. And then I'll share some examples from my classes about how I tried to involve students in a collaborative process of peer evaluation in a way that I think works for the accelerated model and keeps students engaged on task, but also supports them and helps them feel a sense of belonging in the class and ownership, so they're not kind of toiling away in isolation. So here's our kind of 3 items here. The first thing we're going to talk about is the recommendations to increase engagement in distance learning. I think this is really key for all of us who teach online or invested in supporting students and ensuring student success in online environments. How do we get them engaged and keep them engaged? How do we avoid breaking the law by teaching correspondence courses, which we're not allowed to teach, right? So we have to keep them engaged, both peer to peer and instructor to student as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about peer learning online in non-academic contexts, and I have just one book recommendation that kind of covers the theory and a particular case study relative to peer learning in those contexts. And then I'll share how I developed some collaborative evaluation in my accelerated online classes. So the students are still invested in building the course together. They're not writing written assignments or creating something together, but they're collaborating for evaluative purposes in a way that I think proved effective. So the first is, this challenge of online engagement. If you've taught online, you know that it's much different. You can't just look at somebody's facial expression and say, how are you feeling today? Are you feeling kind of plugged into the class? Or are you feeling isolated in some way? And so, we have lots of student supports infrastructure that we've built up in the institution, but it's still, my interest is the interaction between the student and the professor and the course design. What are the kind of instructional, pedagogical changes or modifications that we can make to boost student engagement in these classes? And so I'd like to recommend this literature review, Factors Contributing to Student Retention in Online Learning and Recommended Strategies for Improvement. And this is by Pauline Salee-Muljana and Tian Luo, both from Old Dominion University, published in 2019 in the Journal of Information Technology Education. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of their findings, both from the factors that present a challenge to student retention in online learning relative to their class experience, and then their recommendations for overcoming those challenges. And I think that they really resonate with the concept of peer pedagogy that we're going to develop a little later. So what they found is that, if the students aren't engaged with the class and engaged with their peers and the instructor, it causes problems for retention. And so, one of the things that they find in these contexts is, you have isolated and unsupported students in some cases. The students who maybe enroll in an online class for the first time, maybe they have the expectation of equivalent engagement as in a traditional environment. I know this was a challenge for me. I've for many years taught asynchronous online classes, and then we switched to emergency synchronous distance learning during COVID. And then when I started to teach asynchronously again, the students kept asking me, when are we going to meet? When is class time? And so, their experience in the emergency distance learning that was virtual and synchronous diminished their sense of value relative to asynchronous learning. And so I do try to incorporate, synchronous office hours and other opportunities for them to engage with me that way, but it's still not the equivalent engagement as a traditional environment. It's harder to facilitate. The other challenge that we see is a low social presence, leading to a poor sense of belonging and passive engagement. And so this is, I see this a lot on, discussion boards, and I've heard from other faculty members where, students kind of go through the motions, they complete their discussion board posts, but it's fairly rote, and then their responses to their peers are, generally uncritical, but also not especially substantive. So you get a lot of agreement and smiley faces, but not really a sense of active engagement and not really a sense of belonging and kind of building something together in that context. And the last piece of, the challenges of engagement on online classes that Muljana and Luo found was that the insufficient promotion of student interaction can also lead to a lack of engagement and present a retention challenge. And so this is, both a course design issue and an instructional issue during the class. The challenge of building in opportunities for students to have meaningful interactions and substantive interactions, but also kind of regularly steering them back to each other as a resource. And so I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So those are the kind of warning flags that this literature review identifies relative to the student's classroom experience and engagement as a retention challenge. And so they do develop some recommendations in their review of the literature that I think are valuable and kind of move us toward this idea of peer pedagogy. So overall, what they found is, collaboration promotes engagement. If you're working together, you feel more invested in the subject matter in the course, you feel more accountable, and you get through. So their recommendations involve interactional and motivational instructional materials. And, if you're familiar with the Oscar rubric, I think this kind of coincides with the idea of robust materials as well. But interactive and motivational instructional materials, long ago, when online learning first came to be, it was largely text-based. And I think, classes that are still designed exclusively text-based can present a challenge to students. So incorporating more interactive and motivational elements help engage students a little bit more. The employment of collaborative learning is kind of key to me here. How do we create opportunities for the students to work together in these online classes in ways that, I don't particularly consider just responding to a student's post on a discussion board collaboration. My vision of collaboration is a little bit more meaningful and substantive there. And then their last recommendation here is aiming for responsive and meaningful feedback. If it's all self-grading quizzes, they can move through those pretty quickly, but maybe they haven't gotten that kind of responsive and meaningful feedback there. And so my view of peer pedagogy kind of weaves together all three of these recommendations to kind of see how we can employ collaboration to produce some interactivity and motivational thinking in instructional materials, and also incorporate more meaningful feedback from both the students and the instructor. So I want to shift gears now. So out of the traditional academic environment, we know what the literature says works to promote engagement in our online classes. Now, I want to take a step back and think about where the students might be coming from and their experiences of collaborative learning in non-academic contexts, and see if that can inform our online instruction. And so I recommend this very interesting text by Michael Dzwani. It's Peer Pedagogies on Digital Platforms, Learning with Minecraft Let's Play videos. And I'm not going to get in too much in terms of a summary here. Dzwani develops a theory of peer pedagogy based on his kind of close reading of this interest-based community on YouTube, which are basically walkthroughs and almost peer instructional materials in Minecraft. Minecraft is a big open world video game, if you're familiar with it. And there's a lot of possibilities for ways of engaging with the game. And many users, particularly young users, turn to these YouTube influencers or instructors to tell them what their options are when it comes to engaging with the game. And so this robust community has developed around Minecraft on YouTube, and people spend almost as much time engaging with the community on YouTube as they do playing the game. And by and large, the people watching these are adolescents, so they're under college age. And so I think that's kind of suggestive to us as maybe higher education instructors where the students are coming from. But the thing of value for the moment for us from this text really is this quote that I have on the screen. This is Dejwani's definition of peer pedagogy, which is relationships in which a flat structure emerges between teachers and learners, arranged through a producer's attempts to reduce social distance and their ability to meet a viewer's need for knowledge. So the thing that users find engaging about Let's Play videos is the perception of peerness with the creators. So the person on the other side of the YouTube video is someone like me who plays the game, but who has something to offer me, and we kind of engage back and forth in the comments section. And it's that perception of peerness that fills out this definition of peer pedagogy, this flat structure between teacher and learner. And that particularly the interest-based community around Minecraft is helpful to think about as well. So
can I insert a question here?
Please.
Just a clarification question from Carrie here. Are you referring to the live, like YouTube live videos? Because there's limited engagement with static videos, which is true.
I think some of them are live and some are static, but the creators respond to the asynchronous comments that they've received as well. So the community kind of is self-perpetuating in that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the main takeaways, as we're preparing our online learning environments for new generations of students, is that peer learning, this kind of interest-based engagement with people that they view as peers, that learners view as peers, this is familiar to our students today. So they've been enculturated to understand peerness as a possibility for learning. And I, to me, when you think about collaboration and engagement in online platforms, this is a model for us to think about, and also, a paradigm that they're familiar with when it comes to what they think learning is, and their relationship to knowledge. So I recommend Dejwani's book. There's some really interesting case studies if you're interested in these communities, but I'm also interested in his theorization of peer pedagogy. So that's a little bit of background, both from the kind of online learning and retention side of things, but also some peer pedagogy theory. And what I want to talk about now is just transition into thinking about how I applied this in an accelerated environment where the students they don't have time to necessarily build something together that would take weeks of feedback and drafting, but a way to incorporate collaboration in a meaningful way that's not as high stakes as producing something, but that can be done in as little as 3 weeks. And so, I turned to My Learning, and we do have maybe limited opportunity or limited tools available for peer evaluation on there. If there's not a space where you can put up a document and have your peer annotate it natively on My Learning. And so, a couple of things that I did here, I took, quizzes, which historically, I had used self-grading quizzes in the past. I created short answer quizzes and reframed them as workbooks to kind of lower the stakes. Quiz has a certain connotation for students. Workbooks might be perceived as lower stakes or more formative for them. I also crowdsourced rubrics, so the students had some buy-in in how they were evaluated, and the things that they come up with eventually end up looking a lot like the rubrics that I design when I create rubrics. And then I was rethinking my writing assignments, not to be product focused, but more as challenges. So I worked with these particular writing scenarios and challenged them to address this scenario in a particular way. But you put all those things together, And what it amounted to was teaching an entire class on the discussion board. So I didn't use the quiz function. I didn't have the assignments function. Everything the students did, both their interactions with me and each other, taking their quizzes, posting their writing assignments, everything was done on the discussion board. And so everything was entirely open to the class. Everybody saw what everybody else was doing. And I was also able to engage in that kind of community. So it created a kind of mini workshop environment for us on the discussion board. And so I'm going to break these three things down: the workbooks, the rubrics, and the writing assignments, and just talk about some of what I saw going on in those contexts. So the first element, and some of this is just sort of technical instruction on how to do these things on My Learning, because there's a lot of options, and maybe for some of us, the defaults don't always connect with what we're trying to do. But there are many features on My Learning that can help us engage and offer the opportunity for students to work and evaluate each other. So basically, I linked them to a downloadable Word document that they completed for their quizzes. And these were typically 30-question workbooks, I called them. And so I asked them to post their workbook answers to the discussion board. And crucially, I set it so that you can't see anybody's response until you post. And so that's another option on the discussion board that many of us are familiar with, even from Blackboard. You can set your privacy settings so that you can only see other people's posts once you've also created a thread on that discussion forum. So they post their answers, and then they can see what everybody else has done. I ask them to evaluate 2 of their classmates' workbooks. So they go through each answer, and I'm not necessarily asking them to tell someone they're wrong. I'm asking them to point out areas where they see some difference in their answers compared to their peers' answers. And on My Learning, there's also a feedback tool where you can offer stars to someone. So you can see the star scale here. For 5 stars, this roughly corresponds to an A grade, 27 to 30 correct on the workbook. 4 stars, 24 to 26, that's roughly a B grade, about 80%, and so on. And so the students would go in, they'd write a short text-based response, and then they use the stars to provide that kind of more numerical feedback. And when you're editing the discussion board post, you can use the rate post tool. And this is what I was using, the 5-star rating scheme. It defaults to no ratings, but I developed the star grading scale, and I gave them the breakdown for what it corresponds to, and chose the 5-star rating scheme. And that's how the students completed their quizzes. They worked on their quizzes independently and then posted them, received feedback on their answers, compared their answers to somebody else, and then gave a kind of range that they thought their classmates did in terms of how many questions they think each person got correct. And then I should also note, when I talk about collaborative evaluation, these grades are non-binding. It gives them helpful feedback, but I'm the one who still assigns grades. So I also provide my feedback in the feedback tool. So all of these are my grades are assigned separately, but I have the available information from their peer evaluations to consult when I'm giving their grades as well. So the next piece is the rubrics. And I attended a really engaging professional development workshop at the beginning of this semester on single point rubrics. And I've been interested in single point rubrics for a long time, which are basically a single column. They basically correspond to what does a meeting expectations submission look like. So you develop your criteria that way. And on the left-hand side, you have areas that it exceeded the expectations. On the right-hand side, you have areas for improvement. And so again, on the discussion board, this is my discussion board topic. I asked them to create a collaborative rubric for a technical description in my technical writing class. So I steered them back to the textbook. I wanted them to think about what does our text say makes an effective technical description, and how do we translate that to a rubric? So they had two options on this discussion forum. They could either propose a criterion, which is also a nice opportunity to teach them about the difference between the singular criterion and the plural criteria, but that's, fun for English professors. So they could propose, what should this say? Or they could look at what other people have posted and they can upvote or respond to somebody else's proposed criterion with an edit. And so also using this rate posts tool, I used upvote only. I can't envision the utility of a downvote. That sounds mean. I only used upvotes, and this helped us kind of identify the criteria that the entire class found valuable. And so I'll share an example with you. Here's the single point rubric framework. This is blank, what I gave them. This is a sample thread on my learning from this engagement. So the first poster said, the technical description has an understood audience that it is trying to reach. And then a respondent, they upvoted this criterion, and then they said, this is a great idea and it's important, but I believe it'd be better understood if it was worded differently. So they provided basically an edit to this criterion while voting for it. And so this is exactly what I was looking for in this collaborative rubric identification. Then what I did after the time period was up, I go back to the discussion board, I see which of the criteria were upvoted the most, and that's how I put the rubric together. And all of them agreed that those were the most important criteria that we're trying to meet. And so this is what it ended up looking like. So we came up with completeness, it meets all the requirements, the audience is clear, the intended purpose is clear, it's been edited and proofread and uses APA correctly, and the embedded graphics were also an important part of our instruction for this unit. And so that was also a criterion that came up. And so this reflects the exact phrasing and upvoted criteria that the students generated on that discussion forum. So they have a little bit more buy-in into how they're evaluating each other and how I'm evaluating them as well. And so this also helps them kind of steer back to the textbook in their writing process. They should be looking at this rubric to understand what are we looking for, what makes an effective technical description. And the final piece here is the idea of rethinking assignments as challenges. I think through a Fact 2 recommendation, I just came across an interesting article that recommended reframing reading assignments as tasks. So instead of just giving people pages to read, suggesting, here's what you need to read, and here's the question I need you to answer following this, or here's the information you're looking for in this reading assignment. And this kind of has the same logic, the assignment as a challenge, not just as a product that's there to be judged, but as a hurdle for you to jump over as a challenge, and framing it that way. The goal is to make it a little bit appealing and maybe even to lower the sense of stakes in a sense. So their first challenge in this technical writing class was basically writing an instruction set. And the prompt here is about this audience, Jane and David. They're about the same age and education and work experience as the student authors, but they've never seen toothbrushes or toothpaste. And so this incorporates a little bit of an element of absurdity, and that's kind of what I see as a challenge. And so I'm asking the students to write instructions to these readers who've never seen toothbrushes or toothpaste. How do we apply toothpaste to a toothbrush if you have never seen those things before? And I steer them to the textbook. Here's what you need to use, and then ask for a short explanation. And then the peer evaluation part is there at the bottom. So I asked them to read and respond to their classmates' instructions and explain something that they did well and something that could be improved. And I asked them again to not just speculate on what was good and bad or needed improvement, but to say, here's what I thought was good. You did exactly this thing that's covered in chapter 1, or here's what you need to improve based on chapter 4. And so these were their, in conjunction with using single point rubrics, these would be their kind of text-based responses to each other. And each week and each assignment, we added a little bit of complexity in terms of how the students were responding to each other and evaluating each other's text-based challenges. And so, again, I have the final say on the grades, and I use those single point rubrics, but I have the addition of the peer feedback to suggest to me, what's the level of achievement of this document? What are their peers seeing? If someone's really off base with their feedback, I might connect with them and say, I might respond to that feedback and say, actually, this is what the text says. And so it's an opportunity to just kind of engage both with student authors and student reviewers, and kind of open the way that I evaluate to include input from the class as a whole. So they're collaborating for meaningful feedback. They provide constructive criticism. The goal, again, is to steer both the reviewer and the author back to the course material, so they're not just flying out into nowhere. And crucially, I think, this is more than grade justification. The students in this context are not assigning a number to each other. They're primarily providing text-based feedback. And so this helps me avoid, what happens if you have a lot of grading and a lot of writing to grade, that your commentary is not especially dialogic with the student. You're just saying, here's where you lost points. And so when you incorporate this collaborative feedback, it's more than just grade justification. It allows them the opportunity to say, here's what I know you needed to do, and here's what you did. And it puts those pieces together in a way that kind of keeps steering them back to, what we've talked about in class and in the textbook and in those workbooks, and it knits it together nicely. So just from my experience teaching in this accelerated form, using these 3 elements, I saw higher submission rates for both the quizzes and the challenges, somewhere along the line of 95%. Higher pass rates, again, if you're submitting all your assignments on time and complete, you're much more likely to get through that class. And so I saw those higher pass rates compared to my other previous design of my accelerated classes. And I also heard a lot of positive feedback from the students, and I can just share some of those comments. So not only were these challenges and the workbooks and the rubric on the discussion board, but there was also kind of pinned to the top and ask me anything forum, where the students can ask me or each other questions about the course. Whoever gets there responds first, and sometimes I incentivize posting and responding there as well. But the students appreciated using a discussion page to ask questions and answer quickly. They liked the linear structure. Everything's on the discussion board going through the course. They appreciated the sense of creativity of the challenges. They felt that this was accessible to all students and not confusing. And one student in particular said they were concerned about their ability to excel in a 3-week accelerated course, but the way the course was arranged, it kept the course flowing, and it was a good choice, they said. So that was nice to hear. Again, the students had a lot of success, both staying on task, submitting everything on time, and producing quality work based on all the feedback they got from their peers and from me. And so, here's where I like to think about, taking this next. I have this course shell that I've designed, and I'm continue to incorporate these elements in my 15-week online asynchronous classes, and in my seated classes as well. We're doing this collaborative rubric development as well. But I'm looking to create more opportunities for interest-based peerness to facilitate student collaboration, improve their engagement, and reshape students' relationship to knowledge, so they're not always just looking up at the front of the room or just in the textbook for where the knowledge comes from, but that it's something that we're building together. And so this has been Peer Pedagogy, encouraging collaboration in accelerated online learning. And there's my information. I look forward to engaging with everybody in the chat and our conversation.
Thanks so much, Travis. I love this. I love the 3 ideas that you kind of framed for us. I wonder if anybody has any comments or thoughts. I have a question, but I'll I'll wait. Feel free to unmute or use the chat as well.
I'll go first to break the ice. Thank you so much, Travis. That was really, really interesting. Lots of ideas that I hope to apply. I was curious, having used the post first feature in discussion forums for the purposes of students sharing their work with one another. Sometimes I get pushback that students don't want to have their work be made public, especially not to their peers. So I was just curious how your students reacted to that. Was it low enough stakes that it wasn't potentially embarrassing to them if they produced something that wasn't top notch? Could you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. I have a lengthy statement in the syllabus about this, so they know it going up front. I call it open evaluation, and so I say everything we do has an audience. I tie it into our subject matter. Technical writing. One of the keys to technical writing is audience analysis, and so I see the value of having an audience other than the professor. I situate it in their experiences in writing classes in the past, where you're writing only to a professor and primarily to be judged at that. And so this is an opportunity to communicate in a low stakes way with a broader audience. And I have not had any concerns about privacy or embarrassment, because it's a level playing field basically, and they all know what's going on, and their actual numerical grades are obviously still private.
Sure. I can see where your subject matter lends itself quite well to being aware that what you're about to produce in a normal, quote, real world circumstance would be for a public audience, which wouldn't necessarily be the case for all disciplines. So, but thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's a comment from Ron here that, in many jobs, this sort of peer review is part of it, right? So incorporating more of this to help students be comfortable before they get to that point. Similar to lab work, yeah. And I see this differently, than group projects and things like that. You're sort of involving them in the process all the way along. Did you find that you had to nudge students to engage in this way at all? I wonder if any of them were sort of apprehensive to give each other that kind of feedback, because it's sort of judging each other's work, right?
Right. I think the more it's structured with coherent prompts, the more they're willing to engage. If I just said it's time for peer review, and I talk about this in my seated classes too. If I say it's time for peer review, trade papers, and give feedback, some people will take a red pen and it's like they've waited for this moment their whole lives, and they just cross everything out. And some people just, they take their little green pen and they write a smiley face at the top. And that's the total of feedback they get. So both in my seated classes and online, I try to give them as much structure as possible. And asking them to turn it back to the text kind of takes judgment out of their hands, because it's like, don't take my word for it. Take Mike Markle and Stuart Selber, who are the textbook authors.
Right. Yeah. Citing those text examples, and just like we do when we refer students back to the syllabus for something that we have to keep repeating. Right. Right. Yeah. Interesting. Other thoughts or questions? Anybody else doing something similar? I really like the idea of collaborating on the rubric, crowdsourcing. I like the way that you did it, with upvoting and having a statement that students react to.
I just wanted to follow up on what Ron said, because it's a really excellent point about, in in middle-class jobs, your work will be seen by others. So that's a really good point. And I think that's a helpful way to frame it for students, that we're not trying to expose you, but rather give you real world experience. So I think that's really, really a nice way. Framing is so much of the whole thing, right? How you tee it up has everything to do with how people experience
Right.
it.
And to be honest, like, my collaborative experiences online are not all positive. This is a positive experience, but in another context, I've taught online, and I actually asked them to produce something. It was an accelerated course, and I gave them what I felt like was enough time to do it, and put them together and monitored their discussions. And I had a student, very upset. Their peers were not engaging, and they sent me an email that said, "I don't agree with group work in college." I said, "Oh, well, interesting. Not optional." And I turned them to like the NACE competencies that show that employers think you need the ability to work as a team, and the reasons we do these kind of things. But in technical writing, it really helps that I can turn it back to the subject matter, and the fact of evaluating, which is more communicative than building something where you're sharing a grade. It's a lower stakes than that. I think that helps as well. I can respond to Jamie in the chat too. I think
Yeah.
my classes are capped at 24 for the accelerated. Sometimes I'm nice and I let a 25th in over the cap, but that's the limit. The large online classes from 150 to 200, that would be a really big rubric if you tried, or you'd really get to see how the students negotiate those upvotes and get some really substantial data on what they think is the important criteria. I think this might scale. I have no experience doing that, and I'd be interested to hear if anybody else had ideas for how this might need to change to work at that scale. Thanks, Jamie.
That would definitely be interesting to hear some feedback on, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Just one last thing, Travis, for me, you were alluding to the fact that you're always looking for more. Do you have anything that you've come across that you're anticipating incorporating?
Well, again, I'm interested in steering them, now that I like how the collaborative evaluation piece goes. I'm still eager to kind of start to nudge them back to co-creation. And incorporating both of these elements is something that I'm interested in doing. And so, one recommendation I've gotten from, I can't remember the author right now, but talks about boosting collaboration in a technical writing class by collaboratively editing a document. So not collaboratively creating something, but giving them a document that they need to refashion for a new context and for polish or for a new audience. I think peer collaboration could work in that way, in a way that, again, is lower stakes than saying, here's a blank page, fill it together. You say, here's a text, work together to figure out what's wrong with it and what needs to change. And so I think that's the next step for me, is to think about incorporating more collaborative editing in a technical writing class. If you give them, particularly in accelerated context, if you give them something to work with, some raw material, you're kind of giving them a little bit of a jump start, so they don't have to start from the blank page there. So I guess that's the next thing that I'm going to be working on, is nudging them back toward co-creation.
Yeah, I like that idea of collaboratively editing something. Great.
In full disclosure, as alluded to, I work with Travis, but I really love what he's doing here with this.
He's a plant.
Because Well, I say that because I wasn't. I was in higher education, and then I went to industry, and I was a team lead for a help desk and a team lead for a technical writing team. And I can tell you firsthand that some of the biggest challenges we had were in those arenas. You have to be collaborative and you have to be critical. There were times that in the help desk we would hear people giving wrong information, or in technical writing, because the end product is something of significance and importance. It has to be right. So there is a point when you are reviewing or critiquing the people in the cube right next to you. And I think because this isn't done more often in higher ed, they were often the root of some of the biggest issues on the team, were sort of the "how dare you edit what I did" type of thing. And so I see a tremendous value with incorporating as much of this as possible, because it's that, in a sense, it's a soft skill. And it's something that probably doesn't have a widespread basis in traditional college coursework. So I'm a huge fan of this concept.
I always start my collaborative units, both seated and online, with like an informal poll. I ask them, how many of you have worked in a group before? Everybody raises their hand. And then I ask, how many of you have been taught formally how to work as a group? And nobody raises their hand. And so I think that's some glaring, let's call it advice for those who are assigning collaborative projects, that, introducing some collaborative principles is really helpful. How do we form a group? How do we talk about project management, task scheduling? How do we ensure everybody's doing equal work? And so I can recommend another text. It's called Team Writing by Julianne Wolf. And I use this in my technical writing class sometimes, but it's research informed advice and recommendations on teaching collaboration. And there's some really interesting case studies and examples that she goes into. But if you're just looking for like, what's something I can pick up quick and present to my students, here are some tips on working as a group, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, that's a great point. Asking students to do something, but making sure that we have outlined, how to do this successfully, so that they all feel comfortable, right?
I have a question about the rubric, the crowdsourcing of the rubric. Well, actually, two-part question. Are the students incentivized for participating in the creation of the rubric? That's part one, I guess. So like, what if they don't? And then part two is, did you ultimately then use the rubric? And if so, what if some portions of the rubric were missing, that nobody in the group came up with them? So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I require posting to that forum. It's part of their discussion board grade, basically. And so it's part of their weekly kind of workflow to share their thoughts, either by proposing a criterion or upvoting somebody else's and commenting. You can't just click upvote and log off. You do need to write something. Typically, with 24 people, I usually get all of the criteria that I'm looking for covered. I tell them that, I'm the final arbiter of what goes in here, right? So it's collaborative with me too, right? I'm not stepping out. If I step out, they don't need me.
Benevolent dictatorship. Right. I get it. Okay.
I guess that's one way to characterize it.
And then you do use the rubric to score their work.
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, single point rubrics don't program especially well into my learning. And so I just copy and paste that into the text feedback box and I fill it in that way.
We'd love to see an example of what that looks like too. I don't think you didn't have one of those on your slides, did you? Maybe I missed that one.
No, I didn't include that. I mean, it's
a picture of that would be interesting.
You can maximize your feedback box on My Learning. So if they have a text submission, and you got your little, the programmed rubric, and then the place to enter your grades, and then the text-based feedback. You hit maximize and it fills the screen, and you post it, and it looks like any other document that you might be working with. And so visually they can access it and expand it so it doesn't look tiny.
All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and just do a quick wrap up. This is the last session, so there is nothing else to stick around for, except in the first link, you can find recordings to all the sessions for this week, slides, resources that were shared by all of our speakers. So I want to thank you for those of you that have attended this week. Thanks especially to Travis for sharing what you've been doing, giving us some practical strategies that we can start incorporating and thinking about, and also some information for further research and exploration. So I appreciate you and your time, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks for the opportunity.